Good evening, pondering pastries, and welcome to another episode of CyniBytes, your source for games industry discourse. Sony announced today on their blog that they'll be releasing their own mini retro console, the PlayStation Classic, on December 3rd, 2018. The price will be $99.99. It'll come preloaded with 20 titles, including Final Fantasy VII, Jumping Flash, Ridge Racer Type 4, Tekken 3, and Wild Arms. The console is 45% smaller than the original PlayStation, and it'll come with 2 controllers so that you can play supported multiplayer games. Those are the regular PS1 controllers, though, not the DualShocks. My initial reaction to this news is, meh, just meh, and it's not even Sony's fault. No, my malaise towards the PlayStation Classic has more to do with how Nintendo rolled out their mini consoles, which I understand is completely unfair to Sony. But the bad taste that Nintendo put in my mouth is enough to foul my attitudes towards this mini console. And I know this is about Sony, but I think that I should briefly talk about my NES and SNES Classic experiences for the sake of perspective. When the NES Classic was announced, I was just as excited as everyone was for it. I remember with fondness playing the NES at a young age, and the thought of having a handful of those games available to play in a small console was an exciting prospect. I thought that the NES Classic was a bit overpriced, but I was still willing to huck some money to Nintendo anyway. Release day came along and I decided to check out a few places, and it was nowhere to be found. However, I wasn't surprised. There was a lot of buzz about this thing, so I was fine with having to wait for another shipment. I waited some more, and I never once saw a NES Classic on the shelf in the wild. I was pretty upset that Nintendo mishandled this so poorly. They were giving this bullshit narrative that they didn't know how in demand this was going to be. Whatever, fine, because a short while later, they announced the SNES Classic. I thought, okay, they messed up royally the first time, but they should have the kinks worked out for this one. Release day rolls around for the SNES Classic, and I still can't find it on the shelves. Again, I thought, this is release day, the last one sold like hotcakes, I'll give it a while to see if they get them on the shelves. And they just didn't show up. In fact, I think that the first time I saw a SNES Classic on a store shelf was maybe 3 or 4 months ago. I was so excited to get one of these things, and Nintendo jerked me around for so long that I just didn't give a fuck about them anymore. I didn't want a NES or SNES Classic sitting in my game room, reminding me of how shitty Nintendo was with how they released these 2 throwback consoles. But let's not steal Sony's thunder here. The reason for telling that experience, one that I'm sure many of you share, is so you know where my headspace is in relation to these mini consoles, and it's not in a good place. But let's put those negative NES and SNES experiences aside and focus on the PlayStation Classic. I don't know why Sony didn't just announce all of the games right out of the gate. They 100% know all of the games that are going to be in the Classic today. I'm sure that this is some kind of marketing technique to keep people interested. They even mentioned something about staying tuned for another blog post that will list out all of the games. The price point does feel high at $100. Though in fairness, a lot of these games are going to be more robust in terms of their amount of content than the NES and SNES games, so perhaps that's one of their angles to justify the price. Speaking of the price, something odd I noticed is the Classic doesn't come with a power adapter. It comes with a power cable, but the plug end is just a USB. I suppose maybe Sony was thinking that USB power adapters are so ubiquitous that there's no need to include one. But either way, for $100, it seems like a cheap move on their part. But that's really all we know. What I can say for myself, just based on the current information I have, is that I'm probably not going to be picking this one up. And realistically, I don't know if there's any titles they could include on the Classic that would change my mind for a $100 price point. Except for maybe Hogs of War. Now that is an underrated gem of a game. But despite not having arguably the best turn-based strategy ever, I think that the rollout for the PlayStation Classic is going to be so much smoother than Nintendo's mini consoles. One, I think that Sony saw how upset consumers were with how Nintendo handled their releases, and 2, I just don't think that Sony is in the business of creating artificial scarcity. They know that if consoles are out there, that means people can get their hands on them. They won't cut off their nose to spite their face like Nintendo does. Except for when it comes to crossplay, then they'll absolutely do just that. And with that, pastries, you've been given the sticky. But while we're waiting for news on the remaining games on the Classic, I want to hear from you. Do you plan on picking up a PlayStation Classic? What games do you hope will be one of the lucky 20 to make it on the console? Utilize that comment section below. Let's have a conversation. For updates on my content, might I suggest following me on Twitter at Professor_Cynic. And as always, my pondering pastries, I remind you to stay cynical.